inducted into the US Congress, sworn in on the Bhagavad Gita. So she will talk about interfaith, she'll talk about being a Hindu from Hawaii in Washington, D.C. That's Saturday. And then on Sunday morning, I'm starting at the 14th Street location of Inside LA, a 5-week series on the Jataka tales. So if you're interested in past life narratives, that's where we first met. I'll be there talking about the past lives of the Buddha. Now I want to introduce James Mallinson. And he and I have been on the same panels in Poland and in Flagstaff in the last few months. So it's good to see you a third time. And he created a slideshow just for us. I'm so honored. And James has really spent years in India, and I'm hoping in the question and answer you will ask for some of those details. I first became familiar with his work when I read the book based on his dissertation, which is on a translation of the textbook Khetri Mudra. So if you're familiar with that tradition, I know my own yoga teacher went through this training where you slightly, gradually loosen your tongue with a little bit of a knife action and let it heal, and then you're able to invert your tongue up into your nasal cavities and close off and experience some remarkable states of bliss. And it's interesting because there's people in LA that do this. And we had a talk about that here once some years ago, and a whole bunch of them showed up, and they looked like very happy people. So you might want to ask him about it. He looks pretty happy, so you can ask him about that practice. And he did his PhD with Alexis Sanderson, who is now retired and living in Portland. But Alexis had lived, as had our good friends and acquaintances, the Hughes family, for many years with Swami Lakshmanju. And Swami Lakshmanju is the sole, or was the sole surviving purveyor of many of the details of Kashmir Shaivism that are quite remarkable, and our friends here in Culver City have dedicated decades to transcribing his lectures and sharing with people the many videos they made of his life. So we're cousins in a sort of regard, okay? It's sort of a big extended family when it comes to India. I hope, again, you can ask him a little bit about his own studies in Oxford. And I want to introduce these people to you. Some of them are off the street. I've never seen them before. Some of them are folks that are in our various undergraduate classes, and some of them, many of them, are graduate students in our Master of Arts in Yoga Studies. And James is on a 5-year European Union research project. Much of this will derive from this recent research that he is compiling. He's also on faculty at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, which has one of the 3 master's degrees in yoga studies, where James also teaches. So, are you ready, sir? Okay.
Absolutely. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? I think I might not stand because I like to move around a bit when I'm talking. Thank you very much indeed, Chris, for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. As you say, I think there's only 3 master's programs in the world in yoga, so SOAS has got one, you've got one here, and the other is Venice, isn't it? Where I'm actually going next month. But I think you're quite a long way down the line from us. We've got a lot to learn from you, so I'll do a bit of that industrial espionage last time here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about Hatha Yoga and illustrated history. I'm going to dive straight in because I've got quite a lot to say. I haven't timed it, and I'm worried we might go on too late tonight. But so I'll try and be done by 9 o'clock, and we can have some questions then. Now the first, so as Chris said, I've got this research project going on for 5 years. We've got a 5-6 person team, and it's called the Hatha Yoga Project. So we're looking into the history and current practice in India of Hatha Yoga. So first question is, what is Hatha Yoga? It's a question I'm still asking myself, because there are various different meanings. Now, I am primarily a textual scholar. I do sort of use fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork in my studies, although we have actually got a full-time ethnographer on the team as well. She's doing a great job. But I'm going to start by looking at, now sorry, this is too small, I wasn't sure how big the screen would be, but I'll talk you through it. These are the earliest textual definitions of Hatha Yoga. Okay? Now the first text to give a systematic description of its practices is a text called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, probably 13th century. It doesn't actually define Hatha Yoga, but when it teaches it, it's clear that the distinctive feature are these 9 practices called mudras, which are various physical techniques for manipulating the vital energies in the body. The breath and semen in men is pretty crucial to it, because you don't want to lose it. This seems to be the basic message of that text, and also another text which I'll talk about later on, the Amrita Siddhi. So this is the sort of earliest teachings on Hatha Yoga. A slightly later text, probably the Amarauga Prabodha, it says that, I won't read the Sanskrit, I haven't got time, but Hatha is Prabhanjana Vidhana Rataha. So it's intent, it's focused on controlling, managing the breath. But it then also says it's of 2 kinds, depending on whether it is to do with manipulating the breath, vayu or bindu, which is in the vital principle in men equated with semen. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Now, then the last definition I'll look at now is from the Hatha Pradipika, often known as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, but it's never called that in its manuscript colophons. Just Hatha Pradipika. So Hatha, yeah, a quick word about Hatha Yoga. In that compound, the best way to understand it is that it's yoga as a goal that is achieved by means of Hatha. So Hatha is a method of practicing yoga or of achieving yoga. But it can also be sometimes understood as an adjective, but that's sort of the primary way of understanding it. And in the Hatha Pradipika, which literally means a light or a lamp on Hatha, the sequence of practices that constitute Hatha are said to be asana, so posture, kumbhaka, breath retention, various wonderful, amazing practices called mudras. So those would be the ones that I mentioned from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. And then finally, Nadanusandhana, which is listening to the internal sounds in the body during meditation. Now, and also I should add that in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, Hatha Yoga is not only the 9 mudras. You know, it teaches the 8 limbs of yoga as taught by Patanjali, and then says in addition, you know, one should practice these 9 mudras. So now, what I focus on in my research, looking into the practices, is the distinctive features. So the mudras and the asanas as well. So by the time of the Hatha Pradipika, we start finding these kind of more complicated, complex physical postures being taught under the rubric of asana. So I look at those quite a bit, and then I'm going to finish this talk with a section on the historical development of asana. And breath retention, I'm not going to talk much about. It's a very, as I say, I only want to talk about the distinctive features of Hatha Yoga. In just about all yoga traditions, we have a teaching of a fairly simple pranayama breath control method of alternate nostril breathing. Hatha Yoga does add these very distinctive particular methods of inhalation or exhalation. I think lots of you will probably know things like Pastrika, Ujjayi, and so forth, but I'm not going to talk much about those. That's a sort of a subject in itself. I'm going to concentrate more on the mudras and the asanas. But first of all, okay, so that's, yeah, if we look at texts, that's what Hatha Yoga appears to me. But then, through ethnography, this was at the Kumbh Mela in Nasik in September last year. Okay, so this is Sadhu Ninda Mahapape, isliye Jatadhari Hatha Yogi Nagna Adi Sadhavam Ka Upahas Na Udayan. Basically, don't take the piss out of holy men who have dreadlocks, are Hatha Yogis, or are naked. Okay, so what's going on there? You know, how can one reconcile that with this, what we find in the textual tradition? So this is something I think we really need to bear in mind in general, not just with yoga, but particularly with yoga in trying to think about its history and its practice is that the texts are just like a very small pinhole onto what was really going on. And we have to engage with the living tradition, and the living tradition of the words as well. So Hatha has a very definite meaning of force. And I was talking about this earlier today. It was only made clear to me recently how in modern yoga practice, I think people talk about Hatha Yoga, and that's seen as a rather sort of gentle asana practice. Whereas actually Hatha in Hindi, Sanskrit, is complete opposite. It's like total forcing yourself to do something. It's hardcore. It's giving it your all is what being a Hatha yogi means. And in this context, what it refers to is really sort of extreme practices like holding your arm up in the air for 12 years or something like that. So these are all associated with, and I'll talk more about that later on. And this is actually, there are various ways one could approach the subject of Hatha Yoga, but I'm going to approach it more from this sort of Hatha Yogi angle today. So I'm sorry if I'm giving you a slightly biased presentation, but I think this is a sort of neglected side of it in Hatha Yoga studies, so that's what you're going to get from me today. Right, after that introduction, I don't want to talk much too long, we're going to go past 9 o'clock, I better hurry up. Right, so I'm going to do a quick sort of, okay, so the texts of Hatha Yoga first appear around the 11th century, 12th century. The text called the Amrita Siddhi, which I'm going to talk about later on, which I think we can now definitively call the earliest Hatha Yoga text. But my contention is that a lot of the practices taught in it will have been practiced for 1,000 or more years beforehand at least, and it's just their first time that they're written down is in the Hatha Yoga corpus. Now it seems pretty clear, I think you probably will, those of you who study the subject know about Johannes Bronkhorst's work on Greater Magadha and so forth, and the early history of yoga. Now we've got a point to here. Anyway, and I just point my finger, but this kind of region here, Magadha, okay, seems to be where a lot of the concepts and practices associated with Hatha Yoga and yoga more generally understood first appeared, and that is in that region that Jainism and Buddhism developed. So if we look here, so this is oh gosh, I can't remember, sometimes I put the captions up, but I've forgotten this one. I think this is 4th or 5th century Kashmir, this statue of the fasting Buddha. Okay. Now it's rather odd in that the Buddha, in the Pali Canon, it's clear that he tries various techniques, some of which are clearly Hatha Yogic. So he tries pressing his tongue back against his palate, he holds his breath for long periods, he fasts a lot, but after a while he says that all these are useless, these are no good, they don't get you anywhere. And he adopts the middle path and becomes enlightened like that, sitting under the Bodhi tree. But so it's rather odd that one should find images of him fasting if he said that it's not much use. And I did ask, I asked an art historian about this, and they said they didn't really have an answer, apart from the fact that in India, people expect ascetics to be able to put up with extreme hardship and so forth. So even if the Buddha thought it was no good, it's still a sign of his power that he was able to do it. So whatever he may have said about the middle path, I think the message is, in India, asceticism is valued extremely highly. Okay, this is also from the Pali Canon. As well from the Jataka, this story. So now, it's clear from the Pali Canon that descriptions of other ascetics doing things, that there were lots of practices similar to the practices of Hatha Yoga, and also the wider kind of complex of austerities undertaken by ascetics at that time. So what do we have listed here? So this is quite funny, this story. Basically, the Buddha falls in with a gang of ascetics wandering around, these shramanas or whatever they are, and they get to Varanasi, I think it is, and the leader of them suddenly says, right lads, come on, do your stuff, do your show, because if the king comes along and sees us, then there's a chance he'll patronise us and we'll be quids in. So what does he say? Now, by once conciliating kings, a man may live happily all the years of his life. So now some of you do the swinging penance, the Vaguli button, or that, this is Cowell's translation, I would actually translate that the bat penance. Vaguli Valguli means a bat, so this is hanging upside down from a tree, which I might talk a bit about later on. Some lie on thorn beds, some endure the 5 fires, some practice the mortification by squatting. Now this comes up quite a lot, and this seems to be some posture, perhaps a forerunner of a sort of Mula Bandhasana and so forth, where pressure is put on the perineum. Some the act of diving. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I think it's probably diving is an incorrect translation, and it means remaining in cold water at night when it's freezing cold. Some of the texts. Okay, and here's another reference again from the Digha Nikaya, talking about a stander up. So we get references to these people doing these tough physical austerities, such as standing up for years on end without sitting down. We also get, actually, I don't think the Pali Canon mentions years on end, but there seem to be classes of ascetics who will stand up all day long, and then when the sun sets, they'll just remain sitting. They'll never lie down. And this is perhaps mentioned. So here I'm going to move on to Alexander the Great. So from the geography of Strabo, so Alexander the Great reached northwest India at the end of the 4th century BC, and he also meets some ascetics who are doing similar practices. So 15 men standing in different postures, sitting or lying down naked, who continued in these positions until the evening, and then returned to the city. And there's another reference also in Faulkner's translation of Strabo about 2 others who gave an example of their fortitude by retiring to a neighbouring spot where the elder, falling on the ground supine, endured the sun and the rain which had now set in, being the commencement of spring. The other stood on one leg with a piece of wood 3 cubits in length raised in both hands. When one leg was fatigued, he changed to support the other. Okay. So the point is that we know that ascetics for at least 2,500 years have been doing these kind of things. And some of them are quite closely related to the more sort of technical methods of Hatha Yoga, but none of this gets written down until about the 11th century in the Hatha Yoga manuals. And in fact, the other stuff, the kind of more extreme stuff, never gets written down. It's only passed on by word of mouth, how to do these more extreme tapasyas. Oh, there's a picture of the backed penance. This is from an 18th century, early 19th century manuscript of a text called the Jog Pradipaka. So it's like a Hindi version of the Hatha Pradipaka in the British Library, and that's actually on the cover of the book I've got coming out in January. You may recognise it from that. And then here's, the most. I'm always a bit nervous talking about James when Chris is around. The most extreme ascetics in the Indian tradition, of course, are the Jains, and they too practice pretty fearsome austerities, sitting down and fasting until death, this kind of thing, not moving. This is a sort of interesting key point of early yogic techniques, early tapas, and maybe not early even up until the last 200 or 300 years, is generally associated with immobility. Now yoga is seen as these flowing techniques, flowing asana sequences and so forth. In fact, it was absolutely kind of essential to remain totally still, and still everything, still the breath, still the mind, and so forth. And of course, there's sort of classic examples of Jain Tirthankaras standing up for so long that the creepers grow up around their legs and so forth. So again, it's this great powers or great endurance of ascetic practices. This is an image, this is from Kashmir, 4th century, Harwan, and this seems to be, so we've got the Buddhists, well the Buddhists not really doing extreme ascetic practices, but the Jains, and then there's all these references to Shramanas and Ajivikas in these early texts, in particular the Pali Canon. It's quite likely that on this 4th century tile from Harwan and Kashmir, we're seeing Ajivikas in some sort of squatting posture.
Could I invite people to move in so that more people can see the photos?
You don't want to see I'm afraid without being able to see the images, I don't mean that.
Yeah, there's this wonderful space where we can sit.
I can stand a bit further back. Yes, and in some Jain texts, Mahavira is actually said to achieve enlightenment in this posture. But it's clear that these aren't Jains because they've got hair. So the supposition is that they're probably, perhaps Ajivikas or Shramanas of some sort. And now I think I've got 1 or 2 pictures just to show how, the Pali Canon reference to sitting surrounded by fires and so forth is from 2,500 years ago. This still goes on. This was in my camp at the Kumbh Mela. I think this was Haridwar. Haridwar, 2010, I took that one. And again, actually a few, so this is the Dhuni tap, or the fire penance. And at the end of this, quite a few sadhus who do this penance will do some, what we would recognize as yoga postures. It's actually quite dangerous, because this is all still hot, and if you're doing balancing things, they occasionally fall over and burn and stuff. This is, the way the Ramananda, so this is the tradition I'm a part of, the Ramanandis, and it's an 18-year course, and this is the final stage of it, where you have so this is in the height of summer, midday, with the hot sun beating down. And the idea is, with these practices, these austerities, the word for them, and also the word for what they're meant to produce, is tapas. It's from the root tap, meaning to heat. And it generates, it's kind of, the heat is like a power, an energy created within the body. And it's also closely associated with remaining celibate. So this, we see some of the techniques, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of Bindu and the Hatha Yoga techniques. This is kind of why they're all closely, why it's tied together with tapas. Yoga and tapas are kind of two parts, as seen as two complementary endeavors here. Here's another Ramanandi one who'd been standing up for, I think it was 11 years when I met him. It was a rather long time ago, that one.
Is he still standing?
Normally they sit down after 12 years. Some of them going on for another 12. But I haven't seen him since. But yeah, normally they'll just go for 12.
And there's no hair extensions there?
No. I have heard sort of disparaging remarks about one Baba who stole the jata off a dead Baba and tied it in. My uncle Guru knew that. And then the Buddha mentioned the lying on the bed with nails. This one seems to have died. I mean, occasionally people do it now, but it was obviously very popular sort of late 19th century. You get a lot of pictures of it. Again, this, as I mentioned before, the Buddha says that he tries pressing his tongue against his palate. This picture, it's a rather strange picture, but it brings back fond memories, because when I was doing my fieldwork, and when I was doing my PhD that Chris talked about, this is the first sadhu I met who could do khichdi with rum. It's a long story. He wouldn't chirp to me at first, but eventually he did. Okay, this is just a quote from the Mahabharata. Tapasa siddhim amvicha, yoga siddhim cha palaka. So it's saying, go after siddhi and yoga siddhi, so perfection or power, magical power, and perfection of yoga by means of tapas. So just to illustrate how the two are quite, they're pretty hard to distinguish, particularly in the Mahabharata. In early texts, tapas and yoga are seen as part and parcel of the same thing. Okay, I'm going to keep moving fast. Now, it seems that this is a thesis I haven't completely thought through. Maybe someone could do a PhD on it or something. But it seems to me that over the course of the first millennium, tapas, these extreme austerities, are first of all thought of as a bit beyond the pale of the orthodoxy, particularly the Brahmanical Vedic orthodoxy. And they slowly become more accepted. Now this is, some of you may recognize this, it's sometimes known as Arjuna's penance in Mahabalipuram in south-east India. And it's from the 7th century. There's some debate over exactly what it does. It's sometimes known as Arjuna's penance. Now, if we look around about here, you can see the figure of an ascetic on one leg. And I'll zoom in, you can see him here. Go closer up. Now, so by this time, this is 7th century, so it seems that perhaps, if this is appearing on a relief like this, it's been commissioned by the local Raja, then perhaps it's becoming more mainstream. But also I want you to have a look here, where we've got this figure, and I think I've got a close-up of a cat. Okay. Seems to be doing the same thing. And cats are kind of famously duplicitous in the Indian tradition. But I think I found this rather nice picture. So the sense is, like going back to when the Buddha was saying to these guys, that they can't do the show. Well, sorry, not the Buddha, but the leader of the troupe that the Buddha was with, let's do this show. There's obviously this performative element to these practices, which can be seen, viewed somewhat cynically perhaps, and I think that may be what's going on here. And yeah, so here's it's a classic, talking about cats being duplicitous. This is from the Hitopadesha or Panchatantra, I think, the classic story of the cat. It's not a particularly good picture of a cat, is it? It looks like a rat, maybe. Meant to be a cat. Meant to be a cat, and the cat, in the story, convinces these mice that it's a friendly cat and it's really holy and religious and it's dropping its beads all the time. And then the mice come near and the cat eats them. But again, this is another 7th or 8th century from MP Parvati. So the famous story from the story of the birth of Skanda, written in various ways. My favourite is the Kumara Sambhava by Kalidasa. So Parvati, in order to win over Shiva, undergoes extreme austerities. So this is a depiction of that. So again, it's all becoming, a bit more mainstream. It seems a bit more part of Orthodox tradition, and also by the late 1st millennium, we find this is when the Puranas really start being composed, coming together, and then in those we often get stories of sages and kings practicing extreme sort of physical ascetic methods, generally in order to win boons, to win a weapon off the gods, or in this case it was. It's a long story, but anyway, she has to fall in. Shiva has to fall in love with her so that Kartikeya can be born in order to rescue the world. What else to say? Okay, so again, this is just to show this kind of complex of techniques, which are all part and parcel of the same thing. We've got tapas and yoga going on here. So we've got the hanging. This is a early 19th century illustration to the Ramayana in the British Library. Again, most of these things are kind of obvious austerities, arms in the air hanging from the tree. But we've also got pranayama here, and it's clear, I think, more than this one, from the same period, kind of colonial period, South India. We've got the same sort of stuff going on, but again, here we've got some yogic asanas, pranayama. Pranayama is often depicted with the yogi floating off the ground. It's meant to make the body extremely light so that it can float and levitate.
And then we got the water.
Yeah, the Uddaka Gehana from the Pali Canon, which they still do as well, some of them. Although now actually the way it's most common done is they'll sit on a winter's night and have 108 gharas of water poured over their heads, rather than immersing. Again, actually also, yes, we do get a few. I mean, women are extremely rare in the general record. It was Parvati doing her tapas. There's the odd reference to women doing tapas. But in Mughal miniatures, we do see quite a few instances like this of women doing this standing up penance. We might have another one here. Yeah, here's a whole ashram of ladies being visited by a Mughal noble. Again, we have one standing up. We have clearly a sort of tantric yogini type. The others look a bit more orthodox. And here, this is one of my favourites. It's probably from about 1630 now in St. Petersburg. And it looks just like one of these Kumbh Mela camps, but 400 years ago. Pretty much the same without the noise, probably. But here, looking at this guy here, I think I'm going to zoom in. A classic Urdhva Bahu, arms in the air. This was a particular, foreign visitors to India have always been particularly obsessed with this one. We get a lot of Dutch engravings amongst the very earliest foreign depictions of India, of people doing this Urdhva Bahu penance. I've got a couple more here. Yeah, and it goes on to this day. I took that one, that was a long time ago, I think it was in 95. And there's this chap, Amar Bharati, who's quite well known. He appears in lots of sort of photographic records and films of Kumbh Mela. And that's him again. So this was him, early days, and that was him 3 years ago at the Kumbh Mela. So he's had his arm up in the air for 40 years. Now, it's pretty extreme, obviously. although they seem not to be quite as extreme as they used to, because in the old days they quite often held two up, and I don't think that happened. These days there's only one. Now this is one of my favourite characters. I'm going to talk a bit about this fella, Puran Puri, or Puran Puri I think he was probably called. It's not clear from the transcripts. Now he wrote, what's fascinating about him? It's less. In 1792, there was an article about him in Asiatic Researches, so one of the first academic journals on India, set up in Calcutta by the Royal Asiatic Society, William Jones and the rest. And the collector in Benares, a guy called Jonathan Duncan, had sat Puran Puri down and got his life story from him. And then this article is a sort of précis of that life story. Now, I've long been fascinated by that, and there are lots of really tantalising references in it. There's one I'll talk about more in a minute. But you know, what I really wanted to get hold of was the original, his full life story, not crazy. And I looked through all Duncan's records and so forth. I couldn't find it anywhere. But I was preparing a paper on him a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. And he has these travels, which I'll go into in a minute. And I googled the name of one of the mountains he visited, and then up came the original in this. There's another picture of him. In this, thanks to the miracle with Google Books, they had digitized this article in this European magazine from 1810, and in those days, a bit like The Economist today. I don't know if you know The Economist, but all the articles were anonymous, so there were no names. That's why no one else had ever come across it before. And it gives his full life story, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But now I want to focus on one specific part of it. So he says when he was quite young, he must have been, I guess, a teenager, maybe late teens, he decided that he wanted to undertake some extreme religious practice. And so he went to a mela. Significantly, it wasn't called a Kumbh Mela then, but that's a different matter, at Allahabad, and it would have been, I think, around 1760, maybe mid-1750s. And he meets a load of holy men there, and he goes to, and he says that one amongst them told him about the 18 Brahma mudras, okay, so these 18 devotions, acts of devotion. And they're all listed here, but I've written them out, so you can see them in more detail. I won't go through them all. You see that actually hang on, we go there, number 11, Urdu Bahu, having both arms forcibly raised up above the head and extended forever in that position. So that's obviously the one that he decided to do. But the reason I'm going off on this long excursus into these extreme practices is, again, you see number, hang on, that's back to number 8, Chaurasi Asana, the 84 postures. So 84 different postures in sitting, such as continuing several hours with the feet on the neck or under the arms. So this is just, again, I want to illustrate how these, it's not, this world of yoga and tapas is very closely associated with this notion of Haṭha Yoga. Number 9 is interesting. I note that Kapali, placing a beetle nut on the ground and standing with the head on the nut and the feet in the air. But remember the name. Also, number 2, Akash Muni, fixing one's regards towards heaven and never looking down towards the earth. And there are various others. They're all pretty crazy and interesting. And more asanas. Number 14, Charangi asana, is a different kind of asana. And so number 16, Panchagni, so sitting surrounded by fire. Okay. Now I come back to that in a second. But the other point I want to make with reference to Puran Puri is that he undertook for 40-something years this particularly extreme, debilitating austerity. And one might think that meant he was sort of cowering by the side of the road, begging, hoping for money to be thrown in his begging bowl or something. Quite the opposite. These guys see that doing these austerities is really charging them up and giving them great power. And he was certainly no shrinking violet. I'm going to just whiz you through his travels now. How am I doing for time?
It's fine.
Fine. Okay. Right, it's fine. When the last one falls asleep. Okay, so his travels. So this is the Kumbh Mela where he started. He started here, and I'm just going to whiz through it because it's a great story, by the way. I've been talking to Eric about it. We think someone should write it up and annotate it. Well, maybe us. We've got plans. then he's up and down the east coast. And remember, this is all with his arms in here. Obviously he's got attendants helping him out. Off to Malaysia, didn't like that much, came back. Through the Gulf, back up to northern India, then out through to the Caspian, up west of the Caspian, all the way to Moscow. And he gets to Moscow. His intention is that he's going to go all the way to England, because he's like all these, this is late 18th century, saying all these Englishmen are coming to look at my country, I'm going to go and have a look at their country. When he gets to Moscow, such a huge crowd, and everyone goes so crazy that he decides this is too much, and he's going to return home. And, the crowds are getting out of control, but he doesn't go straight home. And then last one, well, this is pretty much the last one. He then spends quite a lot of time at the court of the. Oh, it's not the Dalai Lama. It's not the Panchen Lama. It's the Tashi Lama, I think, in Tibet. And something strange goes on. There's some intrigue, and he becomes a go-between between the Tibetan court and Warren Hastings in Calcutta, and he takes down some messages and some dogs, some Tibetan mastiffs, and some strange clockwork. So anyway, that's kind of why the British were interested in at that time. And then finally, he's given a load of land around Benares, and he settles down there. Okay, I think that's the end of it. And it was thanks to finding the original article and finding out about these 18 Brahma mudras. It was at the same time that I was working on the Smithsonian show on yoga in 2013, and there were various images we couldn't make sense of, Deborah Diamond and I, Deborah the curator. And then of course this became clear that this is, and we see this crop up quite a lot, the Akash Muni, looking up at the sky non-stop. Okay, it looks incredibly uncomfortable. And then we also noticed that in this miniature, which is now in Australia, but it's from the Udaipur Mewar region, just about all those 18 penances are shown. I don't know if you can see here, but there's some of them. There's what have we got here? The Akash Muni again, hanging upside down over a fire. This one buried up to the waist. Then once we sort of, that was the key to cracking quite a lot of pictures of what the settings get up to. Okay, now hang on, where am I going next? Right. So Haṭha Yoga, now this, I kind of, you'll be glad to know I'm leaving behind all these extreme gruesome passages and returning more to the textual and the sort of practices that we might possibly consider doing ourselves. But what I want to look at briefly is the, who practiced Haṭha Yoga, okay? And it's pretty clear from what I've been talking about that it's ascetics, it's renouncers, sadhus, sannyasis, whatever you want to call them, people who've renounced the world, who don't have a family, don't have a job or anything like that, and they're full-time devoting themselves to religious practice. And that certainly seems to be the case, to be honest, all the way through until recently. The texts that I work with, and I think the reason that the texts are written down as well, do generally say, and I'll look into this in a bit more detail, I do generally say that the techniques can be practiced by householders, normal people. But I know of no artistic depictions and no historical references to normal people practicing yoga prior to the 20th century. I don't think. Definitely no artistic depictions like this. It's always the extreme ascetics. But amongst the ascetics themselves, there's no kind of sectarian preference. We do often associate Hatha Yoga with the Nats and so forth. And there's a great, if anyone's read anything I've written, I seem to repeat this probably too often. But this is 3 verses from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which basically says that, I won't read it out, but anyone, even the young or the old or the diseased, will get success in yoga through practice. It doesn't matter whether you're a Brahmin, i.e. a householder Brahmin, so not an ascetic, a Buddhist, a Jain, a skull bearer, i.e. one of these Karpalika tantrics who lives in the cremation ground, or even a materialist, okay, so Charvaka. These are guys who just believe in nothing at all. There's no afterlife. It doesn't matter if you do good or bad. Nothing's going to change. The text says that even they will benefit from practicing yoga. The only thing that matters is that you practice. But I think this is great. This is one of my favourite. And it's implicit in other texts, but this is the one text that says it really clearly.
What date do you get that?
13th century. So yes, and then, so what we see with the Hatha Yoga corpus is we see a kind of rush, not a rush, it's because it goes over a few hundred years, but we see texts appearing from the 11th to 14th, 15th century, but from lots of different traditions. It's not like one tradition has got a copyright or a monopoly of yoga practice, and I'll look a bit more at that now. Yeah. So in particular, I want to talk about this project I've got going. We've had a couple of breakthroughs, I feel. We've been going almost exactly a year. And two big breakthroughs. This is the first one, this text at Amrita Siddhi, which I've been working on from this manuscript and some others for probably over 10 years now, reading it. Clearly a very important, seminal, excuse the pun, text of Hatha Yoga, in that it's the first, it's for reasons I'll explain in a minute, it's the oldest one. But we know it's the oldest because we can see that lots of subsequent texts borrow from it. They either take verses wholesale or they paraphrase it and so forth. And it teaches this fantastically. I say fantastic because I've been used to working with later texts, which are often a big mishmash. The text I mentioned earlier, the Haṭha Yoga, I've identified at least 20 texts that it borrows from again. It's just piling all this together, and it's a great resource, but it can be quite confusing to read in one go because it can be quite self-contradictory. But it's extremely useful because also it helps us, because we know it's a compilation. We know that if we find verses in it in other texts, that they're probably the source and that it's borrowed from. And it borrows from the Amrita Siddhi among various others. Now, the Amrita Siddhi teaches this very coherent Hatha Yoga practice, although it doesn't call it Hatha Yoga, but I won't go into why that now. And in great detail as well. I've just been working on the translation of it. We're going to publish it as part of the project. And it goes into far more, one normally expects things to get better explained as time goes by. Normally things get introduced and then subsequent texts go into more detail. It seems to be the reverse actually with Hatha Yoga, certainly with the techniques and the yogic physiology taught in this text and other early Hatha texts, and later on it all just gets much more simplified. So you've got a treat in store when the translation and edition of this text comes out. But the really interesting thing about it is that, I've got this manuscript, 2 or 3 others from Nepal, 5 from Jodhpur, but all probably 18th, 19th century. And then I've got a couple from South India, so this is a palm leaf Grantha manuscript from South India. Then about a year and a half ago, I finally, through Curtis Schaefer at the University of Virginia, got hold of scans of this manuscript, which is absolutely fascinating on so many levels. Not least it's unique in that it's bilingual Sanskrit and Tibetan. So we have the Sanskrit in a probably East Indian, maybe Nepali hand, and then a transliteration of the Sanskrit in Tibetan script, and then in Tibetan cursive script at the bottom, a translation. Okay, and so that on that, even people who aren't interested in yoga, manuscript scholars find this, just a delight in itself because it's unique. We know from the colophon, although it's getting more and more confusing the more we study it, we know from the colophon, so the last bit of the Sanskrit text says it was copied in 1160, okay, which is 400 years older than any other Hatha Yoga manuscript I've worked with. So that's very exciting in itself. Although we now think that perhaps that is a scribe who's copied the original Indian manuscript and then just copied the date, and that the Tibetan bits have been added. Anyway, we know from that this Sanskrit text is from at least 1160. But in fact, we then get information in the Tibetan colophon that the translation was made by a famous translator from the end of the 11th century in Tibet. So that pushes the date back even further. Now, I've been reading this manuscript with a colleague, Peter Daniel Santo, in Oxford, and he is expert in Tantric Buddhism. And we've been reading it very closely, and it's become increasingly clear, well, absolutely 100% clear now, that the text was composed by Tantric Buddhists originally. I won't go into the sort of nitty-gritty philological details, but so this is, this for me was a bit of a revelation because everyone, I think, like most other people, assume that Hatha Yoga came out of Shiva worshipping traditions, but no, it's 100% clear that this. Well, sorry, let me rephrase what I said there. I don't think that means that Hatha Yoga was invented by Tantric Buddhists, just that Tantric Buddhists were the first to write it down. And then we get all these other different traditions writing Hatha Yoga texts. Now, what did I say here? So yeah, key principles first taught in Amrita City. I'm going to rattle through this. You don't need to know. The practice is Mahamudra, Mahabandha, Mahaveda, and various other bits and pieces. This is a list of all the texts which borrow directly from it. So just as, the teachings in it are ascribed to Virupa, who's this sort of one of the famous Buddhist siddhas, Mahasiddhas. And it opens one of the reasons that we can be confident that it's Buddhist is because the bilingual manuscript opens with a verse in praise of Chinnamastha, this tantric goddess who until the 15th century is only found in Buddhist texts. Okay. And also, interestingly, the Mangala, so the verse in praise of Chinnamastha, is not found in the later Nepali and Rajasthani manuscripts. It is found in the South Indian ones, but kind of corrupt. They don't understand it, and they get it all wrong. So we can kind of see a progression. So that's one of many reasons why we're sure it's Buddhist. Okay, this is actually the life-size one of this is much bigger, from Jodhpur in Rajasthan. The reason I put this up is just to, so I've mentioned this, the sort of key principles and practices of Hatha Yoga as taught in the earliest texts of this preservation of Bindu. And then they get onto that, gets overlaid in later texts, not much later, from the 13th, 14th century onwards, the idea of these 6 chakras and Kundalini, and the raising of Kundalini. And the whole thing, and as I mentioned before about the Hatha Pradipika, we get all these different teachings on physical yoga practice. And actually, in its earliest incarnations, the Kundalini chakra practice wasn't physical at all. It was kind of all meant to be visualized. But then as it gets mixed in with these physical techniques of Hatha Yoga, it becomes the sort of physical practices are said to affect Kundalini and the chakras and so forth. So it becomes this big complex mishmash. So here's just another Nepali image of chakras. I'm not sure why I put this one in, just because I like it, I think. But also to illustrate the fact that there were lots of different schemata of the systems of chakras in the body. And often a lot of the chakras are outside the body, above the head, which kind of just goes to show that they're a bit better visualized rather than felt within the body. Okay, now I'm just going to whiz through this. So this point I made about Hatha Yoga in almost all of its texts seems to be a kind of transportable technology. It's not associated with one sect, as was clear from that Dattatreya Yoga Shastra excerpt. And so what that means is that sects, traditions that have quite different philosophical principles and metaphysical understandings will also practice it, and also practice it in very similar ways. So I'm just going to whiz through. These are the 4 main orders of sadhus in India today. This is the Ramananda, he's a friend of mine, Jagannath Dasji, who's a Ramanandi. That's Swami Ramananda, the founder of the order. So it's this kind of devotional Vaishnava dualist tradition, lots of Hatha yogis. Here we've got the naked Naga sannyasis, who are often seen at these Kumbh Melas and so forth, associated with Shankaracharya, but also with Dattatreya. So this is the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. This text I mentioned to you is the first to teach a systematized Hatha Yoga.
What's with all the dogs?
He's an Avadhuta. He's classically known as an Avadhuta, which is another name for these sort of, the ash-clad Jatadhari ascetics, and often they are said to associate with dogs, because dogs are seen as unclean and they don't particularly care about purity rules and so forth. Although then it all gets in a typical kind of Sanskritization or sort of cleansing way. The 4 dogs are said to be the 4 Vedas. I'm not quite sure how that works. So it's Dattatreya, and then Dattatreya is the head god of the Juna Akara, who's the main order of these Naga ascetics you always see in the documentaries about Kumbh Mela and so forth. And then that's his travelling shrine with the Junakara carry around with them. And then there's also Kapila. Now in the Dattatreya, Kapila is the head of the next biggest akhara of Naga sannyasis. And in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, he's specifically said to be the original sage who taught the practices of Hatha Yoga. Then we get the Naths, who I mentioned earlier, generally trace themselves back to Goraknath, and texts like the Goraksha Shataka or Viveka Martanda, it's a fairly well-known Hatha Yoga text attributed to them. And they come out of these tantric traditions, or the specific tantric tradition, the Paschimamaya of Kaula Shaivism, in which the teachings on the 6 chakras and Kundalini developed. So that's Guru Goraknath is said to be the original teacher of the lineage. And then finally, yes, Nirmal Das Udasin. So again, all these, you need a trained eye to tell the sects apart. Basically, they all, have dreadlocks and wear ashes and sit around smoking fires all day and do a bit of yoga, various other austerities. But this is from the Udasin tradition, which traces its origin back to Sri Chand, who was the son of Guru Nanak. So it's closely associated with the Sikh tradition, although over the last 100 years, as certain elements within the Sikh tradition have kind of sought to make it more perhaps orthodox or more rigid, they've kind of gone their separate ways, the Udasi tradition and mainstream Sikhs. But again, they all practice Hatha Yoga. Okay, now go back to the Amrita Siddhi. So what I was saying earlier about how the texts seem, what my best theory, I don't really know why, but why these texts suddenly start getting written down, why does Hatha Yoga start getting taught in texts in the 11th century in the Amrita Siddhi? My best theory is that it's because the teachings are being opened up, they're being put out to households, to ordinary people. Is that because of patronage? I'm not sure, I'm still cogitating on that one. But what we do see a sort of shift in attitude. Now this is the Amrita Siddhi teaching the 4 different types of practitioner, 4 different levels. And it's talking about the lowest level here, the mridu, which I'm never quite sure, the sort of feeble or weak or lowly or something. And it says that they are vyadita durbala vridha nisattva grihavasanah. So they're diseased, weak, old, lacking in energy, living in a house, household. And then the Mando Saha, haven't got much, sort of basically lackluster, Mando Virya, got no energy. But the living in the house is a dead giveaway. It means, because then later on it says that the best aspirants are ascetics. Now, the Shiva Samhita, which is probably 200 or 300 years later than the Amrita Siddhi, borrows lots of the Amrita Siddhi directly, and it actually recycles that passage I just showed you, but it takes out the bit about householders, because now it's being in fact the Shiva Samhita is the most pro-householder of all Hatha Yoga texts. And I think you'll see my translation again here. This is pretty much the last verse of the text. Living in a house filled with children and a wife and so forth, internally abandoning attachment, and then seeing the mark of success on the path of yoga, the householder has fun after he has mastered my teaching. Okay, so yoga is really being now repackaged for ordinary
Okay, so
people.
what's the word for fun?
Create.
Create.
He should play around, he should have fun. And so at the same time, we see, with this notion of Hatha Yoga, this yoga of Hatha force of really going for it, being really extreme, and this associated, the association of tapas with that. It doesn't really fit into householder yoga. So here's just a quick survey of what happens with tapas in the text. So this is the Ishvara Gita, is probably, I think, normally dated to the 8th, 9th century. And in that it said that the best tapas is the desiccation of the body, sharira shoshanam, by means of these various fasts and so forth. So tapas was associated, you saw the skinny Buddha and these practices that heat up, that desiccate the body. But then in the Hatha Pradipika, so here now probably 15th century. The yogi is told to avoid, the last line here, told to avoid kaya klesha vidyam, so observances which harm the body, such as pratahasnana upavasadi, pratahasnana, bathing in the early morning, and upavasa, fasts, and so forth. So already some slight change going on there. And then this is a text from the probably around 1800, the Haṭha Yoga, which, if anyone's awake, I might talk a bit about that shortly soon. But Swadharma Charanam Tapaha. So tapas is Acharana, so following Swadharma, one's own dharma. Okay, so it's getting completely repackaged. You don't actually need to hold your arm up in the air or dry yourself out. You can just practice the relatively accessible practices of Hatha Yoga. And this is also, I think, this is what's going on here. You often, if you read secondary literature about Hatha Yoga, this is the definition you'll normally get. And I think this is kind of, again, a later masking of what the original meaning of Hatha Yoga is, and the meaning that is still apparent, still as it's still understood by yogis, and not just yogis and devotees today. I mean, the word Hatha is a common Hindi word meaning to do something to the max, fully. So here's a kind of esoteric understanding of it, where Ha and Ta are identified as two syllables meaning the sun and the moon, and their union, their yoga, is Haṭha Yoga. Okay? And the sun and the moon can be associated with various different things, the left and right channel, there's the moon in the head and the sun at the base of the spine and so forth. But this seems to be an attempt within the Gorakhnati tradition, actually, the Yoga Bija is a text of the Nats, quite early 14th century. It seems to be an attempt to kind of flip over the obvious meaning of Hatha. Oh, and this is just from the Guru Granth Sahib, a reference still, it's still 1600, isn't it, this bit, to saying various different religious practices that won't get you anywhere. One of them is Haṭha Nigrahi, so forcing yourself with Haṭha, hanging upside down, Adhirahatha Vitamka. Okay, so that's kind of, what is the time? 8:59, I've got to hurry. Sorry. Right, I'm going to whiz through asana and then I'll be done. So this is going to be a potted, high-speed history of asana, of complex, non-seated asana practice. So we see depictions and descriptions in text of seated postures for meditation from actually the Pali Canon, and then obviously the Yoga of Patanjali. Patanjali's Yoga Shastra lists 12, but they're all seated postures for meditation. I'm going to look at the distinctive features of Hatha Yoga, which are these more complex postures. Mayurasana, the peacock, is probably the first to get a description of in a text called the Vimanarchana Kalpa from about the 10th century. Okay, and then, right, so this is the second big discovery of my project so far, completely by chance, and we were looking actually for sculptures of these Nath yogis on this gate. So when we found them, they were amazing, very early depictions, but I'm not going to show you them now, luckily, because I'll go on much too long. But this is this fortified gate at the north of this tiny little town in Gujarat near Dubai, and interestingly, it was patronised, it was paid for by two, and Chris, you probably know more about these guys than I do, Tejapal and Vastupal, they were the ministers at the court.
Yeah.
They paid for this to be done. And so, hang on, we went in looking for here are the siddhas, but, well, I'll show you in a second. Now, the second, after that Mayurasana description, the second kind of big description of complex yoga postures is found in the Jain text, Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra, which is when is it, about 1200? 1200. Yeah. And he describes quite a few. I've given you a couple here, the Duryodhana pose, head is on the ground, the legs pointing upwards, also known as the skull technique, Kapali Karana. And do you remember that when we had with Puran Puri, I said, remember that? So this, we got a good 500-600 years between those two mentions. of a text being called the same thing and nothing in between. So we just know, that we can see a continuity, but we have no other evidence. So this is why I again want to go back to this idea that there's a living tradition that's always going on, and we're just getting tiny pinprick glimpses into it. And the other posture, Danda Padmasana, which is what one might call an inverted lotus. Okay. Now we noticed, we saw at the top here these various figures in complex yoga postures. Until then, the oldest we knew about were from early 16th century, so this has put it back 300 years. We've got the heads down. Now, Chris has seen me show this before in Krakow. But when I was first preparing, I was looking at it, I was thinking, well, people might just think I can turn it upside down. But luckily, I'm saved by the thing that I cursed at the time. You'll see in a minute. Okay, there's this guy with his legs behind his head. These two just are rather like these are the yoga partner on the left, the yoga bells. There's various more. I'm going to have to go back because we were on the ground pointing right up there. I'm going to go back and get some proper photos of them in January, about January or February. These are all zoomed right in. This is the last one. No, you can't really see that one, but this one. There you go. The pigeons help. I spent quite a while, I'm afraid, with James. James would not like that. I was throwing stones. I'd get the pigeon off, it wouldn't go, but actually help me out. Wouldn't move at all. Right, so and then I'm going to whiz through these. So these are the ones from the 16th century. Sri Shailam, Andhra Pradesh, all associated. There's 3 sites. Sri Shailam, Hampi, Vijayanagar in Karnataka, and Sringeri also in Karnataka. So all from a similar time, but I'll just go whiz through these. Again, I took these on this recent trip. I like these ones both. So, and it's about the same period that asana descriptions start to proliferate in texts as well. And this is a very interesting one, which is a Persian text written probably middle of the 16th century. This is a manuscript from 1602. And there are 23 of them. I don't know if any of you saw the show at the Smithsonian 3 years ago. There were 10 of them were on display. So showing the kind of the Mughal interest in Hatha Yoga at the time. And yeah, massive proliferation basically from the 16th to the 19th century. The whole asana thing seems to take off in texts and pictures. I will whiz through it. You get the idea anyway. Oh, here we go. This is this is published by Norman Sioman. He published this book from Mysore, and a text we're working on in our project. Not this one, a text called Haṭha Yoga. We're looking very closely into comparing it with the manuscript we've got with this text. It seems to be the forerunner of it. But this is very interesting. It teaches 120 asanas or so, but some of them seem to be sequences. A few of them are kind of dynamic movements, and then we have things using ropes and so forth. So again, things really start, and this is presumably before any kind of Western, non-Indian influence. And it's possibly, or very likely to be, an influence on Krishnamacharya's teaching. Now, almost wrapping up. So, this is, I could put this picture in, well, it will become clear now, in Anupnath Yogi Baba. So I'm going to talk about him. He was at the, I've known him for a while, he was at the Kumbh Mela in 2013, and he was, so the Nath tradition, which has long been associated with the practice of Hatha Yoga, it seems pretty clear to me, until recently, really didn't engage in complex asana practice, okay, which people generally associate Hatha Yoga with. But in recent years, this has changed. So this guy, Yogi Baba Anupnath, in fact, I met him 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, and I was in the middle of writing a paper, pointing this out. and I was at a monastery in a place called Dwalamukhi in the Himalayas. And I hadn't met him before, but I knew various others who lived there. And he was introduced to me as Yogi Butler, and I said, yeah, what's that all about? How come he's Yogi Butler? He said, well, if you're lucky, he might show you. And I had to sort of go through various trials and tribulations, which I won't bore you with, but eventually he decided I was worthy of demonstrating too. And he did this amazing display of really complex, difficult asanas, and I can see my whole world crumbling before me. rewrite that paper I'm working on. But then I asked him at the end, and I said, Babaji, that's fantastic. Where did you learn your asana practice from? He said, direct from Guru Goraknath. Okay, so he told me he had no living guru, and he was pretty hot on a smartphone. He kind of, he said to me several times in Hindi, he said, if only I knew English, I would be world famous. So he kind of knew what was going on. So, and he engaged in these traditional ascetic, tough practices like this one, but he also did this one, okay, which, like various other postures one might see in modern yoga today, is certainly not found in any traditional arenas in India or in any text or in any literature or anything like that. But it is, and I didn't realise this, and you guys probably know this much better than I do, and you probably recognise the next person. But apparently it is in the 4th stage of Ashtanga or something like that. So you see this stage. Kino McGregor, it's a very famous yogi from around these parts, am I right? Yeah. Okay. So I actually used this when I was getting my grant for this project. I had to go to Brussels and give an interview, and I showed this in order to explain the kind of urgency of the project of getting ethnographers out there and finding out exactly what's going on before globalisation and the interaction between India and the world kind of completely dilutes everything, because that seems to be what's going on at the moment.
Do you think he learned it from her?
I reckon he probably saw it on TV or maybe through his phone. I don't see how else. Thank you very much. We run out of time for questions.
No, we got to ask you some questions.
So I read in an interview you were going to look into a possible connection with Mallinson, the traditional wrestling that's from I think the 11th century.
Okay, well I've looked into the text a while ago. It's been a while. They're all on there. I've transcribed a few of them. The Mala Purana. Is Malakam, is that the one with the pillar?
Yeah, the pillar and the rope version.
Yeah. Well, I haven't. But Mark Singleton, who I'm working with, he's looking into all of that. He's going to be, as part of this project, he's sort of looking more broadly into wider physical practice traditions. But from what I've seen of it, from videos and things like that, I don't see any close connection with Hatha Yoga practices. Certainly not pre-modern ones anyway.
I guess my question would be its possibility in martial training with military.
Yeah, I mean, people have looked into that, and there's a new book about that from South India. Have you seen? I can't remember what it's called. Again, Mark's recently read that. But there doesn't seem to be much crossover with yoga traditions, certainly again in the pre-modern period.
I have an anecdotal comment and then a question. The comment is, during my first semester studying the master's program here with Dr. Birch,
Yeah.
I had lost my father during this semester. The last thing that I shared with him, probably 10 minutes before he had his stroke, was that passage from the Dhammatraya Yoga Shastra. And to continue when he goes more into depth as to what makes a true yogi. So thank you for you and Dr. Birch that you brought that into my life. My question is, probably maybe you could give your own personal opinion, how important and vital is the saving or the cultivation of the seminal fluid, maybe the relinquishment of orgasm in this tradition, or just in your personal opinion in yoga traditions in general?
Well, certainly within the textual traditions. I mean, Yeah, it's crucial. Yeah, right. Yeah, and there's all kinds of things. There's Vajrayogini Mudra, which I've written a bit about. I've redone an article. You know, it's said that there's this whole, I haven't got into it at all, but this whole notion of Raja Yoga. On one level, Raja Yoga is understood as samadhi and, you know, serious practices of meditation, but that actually in Sanskrit text doesn't seem to be the primary meaning. It seems to be associated with being able to behave like a king whilst being a yogi. So that, you know, that's translated as if you master this Vajrayogini Mudra, then you can have sex with as many women as you want without losing your vital energy. That remains crucial. Whatever you're doing, it seems to remain crucial. And the Shiva Samhitas is the same thing.
And the reason why there's certain traditions that seem to throw shade upon Vajrayogini is because it is looked at as like a clever tactic. Or
So what do you mean throw shade?
I've heard that some traditions don't look at Vajrayogini as, I mean, it would be as a technique that...
Or they reinterpret it in different ways. As
a technique that wouldn't be recommended. I don't know, I mean, I don't have the exact...
It's pretty unusual. There's only a handful of texts, actually, when you look at them, that don't teach Vajrayogini.
Okay.
But it has been left out, you know, of Western interpretations or editions of Sanskrit texts from the 19th century. They'll often leave it out because they'll say, oh, it's a, you know, repugnant practice indulged in by low-caste tantrics. I think it's the quote in one of the Iyengar, a translation approved by Iyengar, leaves that bit out. But no, certainly within the tradition. I mean, it may be, I mean, one's got to think, how are these texts used? It may be that they're used by celibate yogi ascetics or teaching the householders, and you're always going to make them feel slightly inadequate, you know what I mean? It's something they can aspire to, but they're never going to manage unless they actually renounce and become. And I think that's possibly one way we can understand these texts. And I think it's perhaps similar to someone going to a yoga class today and seeing, you know, their teacher does amazing yoga posture and they're never going to be able to do it, but they can kind of aspire to a bit of that.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. And the question I wanted to ask was kind of based on how you said before, you know, before the Hatha Yoga texts were actually written down. Clearly, it was more that the common people weren't doing a lot of these practices. It was mainly those who sought to become ascetic, or, you know, they chose that path, you know, by will, and not necessarily that everybody was doing it. But what I want to understand is, maybe by all the people that you were interviewing or talking to when you were down there, the many times that you've been down there, do you believe it's the same situation today? Because I feel even today it's not like the average common Indian is doing a lot of these ascetic practices. So do you think it's more so because of their economic situation, that they don't have a choice, or is there a calling based on maybe the people that you've seen? Has a lot changed in terms of the types of people that were doing it then and the types of people that are doing it today? Because I feel like not in yoga asana manifestations, but just mainly these ascetic practices, it's mainly, I feel, a similar type of low economic status people that are going through it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just wanted to know.
That's not necessarily true. In fact, it's funny, even though ascetics are meant to leave behind their caste and their upbringing, they're still respected for what their caste is. It's sort of slightly, you know, depressing in some
Not in
respects.
the caste sense, more so in the types of people that are choosing to take this route.
Yeah,
So there's
you're probably you're right there. The extreme ascetic techniques are rarely undertaken by well-educated people, but I think there are exceptions. You know, there seems to be a sort of interesting progression of great wrestlers then going on to do the standing up penance, and they're quite sort of sophisticated and cosmopolitan types. But to go back to your question about who else is practicing Hatha Yoga, I think you're absolutely right. I think within, you know, until recently, and I'm, you know, speaking not just to sadhus but householders in India, it was seen as pretty unusual. Definitely only men. If a family person was going to do it, it would only be men. I've met various people who say that their dad, you know, would hide himself away for an hour a day doing his Hatha Yoga practice. But now I think things are changing again, and the sadhus make this distinction between what they practice. They call it yoga, because generally, I mean, I'm sure most of you know, but a Hindi word a Hindi version of the Sanskrit word drops the final A. So instead of what we call yoga in Sanskrit, they talk about yog. I say we do yog, but then all these ladies in the cities are doing yoga. And it's something quite different. They see it, they understand the difference between the two.
Do you feel that some of them have, maybe if they've disclosed to you, if you've asked their stories, like where the teacher has chosen them, or they willingly took the path early on in their life, or
No,
was it another type of discipline? What's the main, I guess?
the teacher, she was certainly in a very limited, I hadn't kind of pursued that. That's probably something Daniela, who's on my project team, has been looking more into. But in my limited experience, so my guru was one of 5 primary disciples and then 75 kind of less important disciples of his guru. And he was specifically chosen as the one that was most suited for yoga practice by his guru. And the others kind of jealous of him for it.
Have you encountered any that maybe came across as this is a better path to choose in the life that I'm leading, and therefore
Sorry?
they choose to take the path as this is a better way to go down life, this is a better option for me in life, than rather than doing what I'm doing in the world?
Well, as an ascetic?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So that's for
Yeah.
what you've seen for
Yeah.
a lot of them.
But curiously, we have this understanding, if we read kind of the normative Brahmanical texts, and they've put this stages of life thing onto it, the 4 stages with sannyasa at the end. And there's this idea that, you live your life and then you walk out and renounce it all. That is seen as completely the wrong thing to do by these ascetics. They respect much more highly someone who's become a sadhu as a child, particularly boys. Then there's back to this celibacy thing. If they've never had any sexual contact as well, that's a great thing. That's seen as putting them on a higher level. So it's kind of reverse of how we might do it. They see if someone were to walk out on a family and become a sadhu, that's seen as really bad. That's not seen as, oh great, they've had a higher calling. That's seen as letting your family down.
So I'm curious about the apparent proliferation of asana at the period, from these few very extreme ascetic practices to what it seems like a multitude of less extreme asana. If you could comment on, do you think did they come about then? Do you think it's older now just being mentioned, or why? Why all what's the purpose of this multitude?
It's a good question. I think it's perhaps to do with, somehow somehow we do find a kind of more life-affirming message behind in the text teaching yoga, and practices which before were not said to be good for the body or whatever. So asana in its earliest treatments is not said to be good for the body, and then later on it is. It makes it light and supple, and makes you healthy and so forth. So this idea behind yoga practice starts to come into the text, and presumably it's part of that, I suppose. I think that's got to be the reason that somehow it's morphing from an ascetic sort of self-mortification into something that's good for the body.
And what do you think? Why? I guess that's the why. Why? I'm curious.
Because I suppose it's part of the teachings being put out to a broader non-ascetic audience. You're not going to be able to convince non-ascetics to hold their arms up in the air. They want to do things that are good for themselves rather than mortifying themselves.
I'm curious to know, like, your own personal story. Did you start as a yogi or as an academic? And how do you reconcile the two? Like, you live as both. And so I'm really curious to know how they both live and coexist in you.
How did I start? I think I haven't thought of that before, but
It's a very American question.
but now you mentioned it, they're both at the same time. I'd already decided I was going to read Sanskrit as an undergrad, and then I went off to Oxford. We went off to India for a year before that, and fell in with some yogis at the end of that trip. So I suppose the academic maybe came first, but no, it didn't feel like it. Neither was sort of conscious decision. I fell into both of them to some extent. And how do I reconcile them? Well, I'm spending much less time in India than I used to. now I'm probably now I'm on this research leave, I've got a bit more time to spend there. But yeah, I've got, a house full of wife and children and stuff, so I can't disappear for quite so long. When it was just me and Claudia, it was a lot easier. Now I've got kids at school. How do I reconcile? I've gone back and forth so often that it's kind of become second nature, to be honest. I feel to some extent that I'm, within the tradition I'm part of, seva, so service is the big thing. And to some extent I feel that my work is seva. So that's the way I can justify it.
Hi, thank you so much. The Mahudi gate and those postures, who were those people? Were they gods? What was the what was the message? Who was it? Was it like the newspaper, the 15th century version of the newspaper?
Early 13th century, 1220
Oh, wow.
or so. Well, the lower registers are amazing, beautiful reliefs of, first of all, it's 12 siddhas of the Nath tradition, and then 8 yoginis, amazing yoginis, and then 8 bhairavas, so fearsome forms of Shiva with consorts. So it's clearly associated with some Nath Shaiva tradition. But then these yogis at the top, can't be sure why they're there, but presumably it means that there were yogis around doing this stuff.
So was it a mirror on the tradition or a mirror of the population? What's the thought? Was it a visual scripture, or was it a mirror of what was happening?
I think it was a mirror of what was happening. We can't be sure. I mean, there's clear parallels between it and Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra, so I brought up a passage or two from that. But they're not direct parallels. There are a few things that are shown on the gate that aren't in Hemachandra. So it's not like they're just taking that and using. So I suspect that it's what yogis round about were doing. And we know that text, Hemachandra's text, was written pretty nearby. That's where the gate is.
And the yoginis were well represented.
Yeah, they're beautiful. But they're divine yoginis, not women, not human women. One of them's got I'm not quite sure what animal it is. It's some sort of bird head.
Fantastic.
I come from a worldview that believes that love is the healing energy that will that has the potential to heal and connect the world. So my question is there how does this form of yoga, is there a correlation between the magical powers, the energies that are embodied or experienced through this form of yoga, and how does it, is there a correlation between that and interacting with other people on that kind of a level to create some sort of healing web of healing energy?
Yes, there is. So that often, and today, particularly meeting the sadhus who do the extreme penances, they often say they're doing it for the good of the world. They often say that through this tapas, they will be making the world a better place, curing everyone's wrongs, and they do it for the good of the world. And then also in the text, quite often, yoga texts will teach, particularly in the context of Kundalini, will teach methods of casting off the body. Okay, there's a thing called kranti, yogic suicide. And that's how when you blast your vital force through the top of your head. But the text will also say that if you want to hang around and do good stuff, do good for the world, then this is how you cheat death. So there are methods of when death, there are ways of telling when death is going to come, and then when you know that and death is approaching, you make yourself look like you're completely dead. Death comes along and goes, nothing to do here. Bring yourself back to life, and that said that you do that if you want to keep doing good on the earth. So there's definitely a kind of altruistic feel to some of these purpose of some of these practices. It's not, I mean, I've often heard yoga, and within the Indian tradition as well, yoga gets criticised as being selfish, and there is a certain element to that, but it's not all.
As things progress from this, like you keep saying penance, and that's a little bit hard for me to understand
That's probably
in relation to the practice. At least that's how I've been practicing, so it's hard. But I hear you saying it, and penance and power, so this magical power, and the performative elements, and then it being repackaged, and the illustration of the sadhana of the current practitioner doing this asana was really a little bit mind-blowing. So my question is, in the text, do they talk about an educated element where you renounce and then you come back from that renunciation to teach, or to how?
Yeah, you can still teach as a renouncer, yeah, sure.
Okay.
But it's definitely a one-way thing. You're not going to come back to renounce. But yeah, once you become a sadhu or a yogi, yeah, then you'll. Well, actually, having said that, the pictures of modern day yogis I've shown you, those guys tend not to. There's almost an anti-teaching feel, and their presence is blessing. So you'll see that, and that's it's probably, I'm sure it's the same within the Jain tradition. That often the devotees aren't necessarily interested in what the yogi's got to say, and the yogi often won't say anything. They do something, obviously, but for them mainly it's darshan, and they get a blessing just from seeing these great ascetics and yogis. So you're teaching. And they wouldn't generally, generally they wouldn't teach yoga techniques to householders either, these guys.
But the texts that you're talking about came about presumably with the purpose of bringing householders, as an example, as a group in. So how then were they brought in? They were given the text, assumed they would read it?
I suppose that this is, it's all conjecture. We really it doesn't, nowhere does it explain how the text is used. I mean, sometimes some texts, so the Keshari Vidya, the text that I did for my PhD, that talks within it about worshipping the book itself. So there's a great deal, and I had this workshop looking at yoga manuscripts a couple of weeks ago, and some texts, some manuscripts end up in such a terrible state, and they've just been copied and copied, and they're full of errors, and they just become complete gobbledygook. But people are still copying them and keeping these books when they're unreadable. Maybe we can make sense of them because we've got a 1,000-year earlier manuscript or something. And people are saying, why does that happen? And actually, often just the books themselves are worshipped. So there's that element of it. But how? Yeah. Well, still, something I'm still trying to work out. What was the point of these texts? Why? Because you can't. It's very few texts that you could sort of build a practice from just by reading it. You need someone to explain it to you. I suspect that they've been put together through patronage from a king or a rich person who's got a guru, and he says to the guru, where are your texts? And the guru says, well, we haven't got any texts. And they call a pundit and say, oh, pundit, sit with the guru, make a text about what this fellow's teaching. Whether they're then used, as I said before, I know of no historical instances, from travellers' reports or any kind of chronicles or anything like that, or artistic representations of householders doing yoga before the 20th century.
I appreciate it so much. It was such a fascinating. I do triangle pose to feel a thing in my body, and then I sit for a while and I feel the thing in my body. This is not talking about that at all.
No.
And so I'm so glad I'm here.
But I think I'm sure that's not all you do when you're doing it. There are other things that come into it. I'm sure there are elements that come into it.
Well, I want to find the magic powers. But then I do have my arm with my head.
Could you comment about the book that Mark Singleton wrote, his findings of Swedish gymnastics and modern practice of yoga?
My only comment is that I'm convinced that he's right. Yeah, his thesis seems true to me. He's now fine-tuning it a bit, but I think generally, I don't think anyone's come up with a refutation either. I know that some Ashtanga practitioners are quite upset about it, but the only sort of attempts at refuting it I've heard are quite, outlandish and circular logic that don't make any sense. That actually this guy Ling, see, I'm not very clued up on it, it's not my thing at all, but Ling had learnt it from Chinese people, learnt it from Indians, which seems a bit of a long shot. Huh?
And the YMCA.
YMCA, I can't remember that, but it's a while since I read the book. But I did see an interesting picture the other day of Krishnamacharya's personal practice room, and he had like a rowing machine, a European rowing machine. It was clear that he was taking bits and pieces from all over, and also from from old text as well. This Sri Haṭha Yoga, and so I've done 2 interviews that I did today, and I'm worried about repeating myself, but I think I said this in one of the interviews. All these texts, people, I don't think many people now are naive enough to think that, yoga is a 5,000-year-old tradition that hasn't changed, and we're practicing the unchanged essence that's been passed on by the rishis or whatever. All these texts that we look at, they're all introducing new things. They're not just recycling things that have gone before. They may package them in a way that they want it to look as though it's an ancient teaching that's come directly from Shiva or wherever. But why would you write a text if you've got anything new to say? So these texts are all appearing because they're introducing new practices.
So I'm actually very intrigued for what you didn't include in your talk, which is the breath retention and the breathing practices. So 2 questions. Do these yogis that you have encountered with, do they practice pranayama, and to what extent do they practice it? And the other part of my question is this distinction between the text and the practitioner. How could you account for the fact that for the practitioner, the ascetic, the one that does all these poses in a very forceful way, we find in the text descriptions and the instructions of doing it Shanaihi, Shanaihi. So why does that happen? Why do you think the text says Shanaihi, Shanaihi, whereas the practitioner does it forcefully? And so my other question is, it's interesting to, it's very interesting for me to see what you present in terms of what the Hatha Yoga is.
I did say I was giving a slightly one-sided view of it. I'm missing out a lot of the sort of Kundalini chakra.
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether this Shanaihi, Shanaihi appears in the context more of the more inward-oriented practices of Kundalini. So the question is...
Can you give me an example, though? In what context Shanaihi? Normally...
So don't worry about it. So just, I'm curious about how much pranayama these practitioners
They do, yeah, they do. And so when they're doing the Dhuni-Tap and so forth, the fire penance, they'll be doing pranayama during that. And also the one, again, apart from that element, when they're doing the fire penance and at the end of it they may do some yoga postures, generally these ascetics do their yoga practice secretly. They do it inside. It's not generally done outside. My guru, for example, does all the 8 kumbakas. He knows them all, and he'll use them different times if he needs heating up or cooling down, and so forth. Yeah, they certainly know those pretty well, actually. They're kind of common knowledge. The Shanai thing. I'm trying to think of an example. And I'm not sure. I read Jason Birch in his article. He sort of cites that as an argument against things being done Hakena or Hatha. But I think the context in which they're normally found is, for example, when you're doing Khetri Mudra and you've got to cut away the binding tendon at the base of the tongue, you're going to do that Shanai generally, or you're going to get a lot of blood and pain. So I'm not sure. It's been a while since I've read Jason's article, but I remember I wasn't convinced by that aspect of it. But we'd have to look at specific examples actually and discuss them one by one. But again, I think generally the point you're making is spot on in that the texts are not designed for the real extreme yogis. It's for practitioners who are going to do it more gently. Or Shanai means gently, so slowly or gently or softly.
Sorry, just in line with what she said, but
So you talked about the Tantric Buddhists actually wrote down the Hatha Yoga. How would you relate Hatha Yoga to Tantric Buddhism, and why are Tantric Buddhism interested in Hatha Yoga?
Well, the text that I'm talking about, Amrita Siddhi, it specifically says, you know, Tantric Buddhist deity yoga, where you, it's in Sanskrit the term uses Svadhisthana yoga, and it specifically says that that practice, which is a key practice of Guhya Samaja traditions in particular, it says it's no good, it won't get you anywhere, because it was quite a long yogic physiology, but you have to destroy the tamas and rajas gunas in the body. And it says this Svadhisthana yoga won't do that. You need to do these three practices, this Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda. And it seems, and then the yogic physiology taught around that is all about this Bindu preservation. It's geared at ascetics. So it seems to be some kind of celibate, ascetic, tantric Buddhist yogi tradition is saying, you know, this is how it's done. And so my contention is that they were just, you know, there were lots of these celibate yogis wandering around sharing techniques, and it's pretty clear, you know, the tantric Buddhist siddhas and the Nath siddhas have a lot in common. You find the same names in their different lists of 84 siddhas and so forth. So I think they were just sharing these technologies, and it just so happened that for some reason the tantric Buddhists were the first to write it down, but their terminology, you know, what they wrote down was then used by the other traditions as well, so it's obviously influential. I think that answers the question.
I'm so glad you're here, because I remember having this question when I was in the Haṭha Yoga class, because there's one shloka that you mentioned the word yogini, and it's pretty clear from the tradition that it's male focused, and that's the practitioner for male. So can you just speak to that? Why it was, if I had the text, I would point out the shloka, but I believe it's talking about the effects of the practice, where they're like in the afterlife or something, overseeing where they circumvent the event of death. But the word yogini is mentioned, and I just wanted to know.
Gosh. Well, in the Hatha Yoga text, yoginis don't get mentioned that often. There's one verse in the Hatha Pradipika which says if you do, I can't remember what practice it is, but if you do the practice right, you'll become worshipped. Was it Yogini Chakra Sammanita or something like that? Worshipped by the circle of yoginis. Yeah, that's. Well, so what I suspect that is, and I don't think I found a source text for it. But like I said, the Hatha Pradipika is a compilation, so there'll be a verse taken from some more yogini-oriented text. But it does mention elsewhere in the Hatha Pradipika, it does talk about the yogini. It says that the genuine yogini is the female practitioner who masters Vajrayana. And also it says in the context of the man that in order to do it properly, you need to find a woman who is expert, a yoga kasa rapastri, so a woman who is devoted to the practice of yoga. So we do get these, you know, these odd fleeting references which mean that we know that women were doing it, but that's it. Yeah. And anything, you know, if anyone else tells you anything, it's all conjecture. Really have, well, no, hang on, having said that, outside of the domain of Hatha Yoga, but within Tantric Shaiva traditions, there's an excellent scholar called Shaman Hatli, and I think his stuff will all be on academia.edu, and he recently wrote a great article on, you know, working out what women practitioners are up to in the Brahmayana Tantra, the very extreme Shaiva Tantra, probably 7th century. So, you know, those who are interested in that, I recommend that. But it's not different tradition for Brahmaya, but yeah, not a Hatha Yoga tradition.
Have you met any women doing this kind of practice?
No, but my colleague has. So we can all look forward to what she has to write. Because it's hard. It's very difficult. I didn't even really realise, but she says that women are quite, you know, in the same way, women ascetics are not respected in Hindu or white Indian society. So they generally hide themselves away within monasteries or convents, ashrams, whatever you want to call them. But my colleague has met a few recently. In fact, I could have shown some pictures. Anyway, yeah, there are some, but there aren't many.
I had to know. I looked up Shanaihi, and it's because I remembered it appearing in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is the Hatha. I have to retain myself. And it's used in reference to the quality of the breath and the moving in and out.
Well, so you breathe out slowly or you breathe in, yeah.
But it also says, I don't know exactly where it says, but it's one of the, and this is just a quick internet search. So.
Well, no, but I think the point that Anna made is completely valid, in that the practices, even though it's Hatha Yoga, doesn't necessarily mean that all the practices have to be done forcefully. It's the general thing is that it's something that you're really doing your utmost to make succeed. The practice as a whole. That doesn't necessarily mean that all practices have to be done in a crazy way.
Yeah, this one that I'm looking at right now says being too hasty results in death of the practitioner.
Well, yeah, there you go. See, that's good.
But the other question that I had kind of relates back to what we were talking about earlier. The modern day sadhus that you've met, how familiar are they with these texts that we've studied so much? Is it more of the word of mouth tradition?
Good question. Yeah, generally the way they'll have learned it. I mean, if I give my only example really is my guru, who became a yogi, became a sadhu when he was 10 or 11, started learning yoga from his guru when he was 13 or 14. And he didn't learn it from texts, but he was a yogi, he's interested, so he would go and buy all the books he could at the bookshop in Varanasi. He lived in a mata in Varanasi for a while, and he took me when I first, when I was 21, 22 or something, first getting interested in the scholarly study of it. He took me to the same, was it Kachori Gully in Varanasi, to go to all the bookshops and buy all the yoga texts we could find, so he would read them, but he wouldn't. I think that was just to kind of broaden his knowledge rather than with a view to learning directly from them.
Do you think there's any cause to think that the forcefulness in the use of Hatha Yoga had to do with not the practice of asana, but the force of raising the kundalini?
Yeah, and I think it's actually used in, I can't remember the verse, but yeah, Haṭha is used as an adjective in one of the things about making kundalini.
And in one of your articles, you mentioned before you had met your guru that someone said, hey, as he was walking down the alley, you should be suspicious of him. What was the backstory with that?
Because he can do Vajrayana Mudra, and I've written about this. I've got a new article which I haven't published yet, but so the idea behind him, he, as I say, he's been a yogi since he was 10, completely celibate, and everyone knows that within his tradition, but at the same time, because he can do Vajrayana Mudra, so it's actually a long, complex argument here, and it's going to be difficult for me to summarize it, but I argue that Vajrayana Mudra originated amongst celibate ascetics as a technique for stopping themselves from ever shedding their bindu, but that then this notion, and part of the technique is learning how to suck up substances through your liquids through your urethra, and then this notion got hijacked by later householder tantric traditions saying this is a method of after sexual intercourse sucking up the combined products, which I argue is anatomically impossible. So when he was walking, I've had long, complex discussions with urologists and stuff like that. When he was walking through our camp before we even met him, and I was with my then girlfriend, now wife, and a sadhu there, nudged her and said, "Watch out for him. If he gets inside you, he'll suck out all your energy." But she's still doing fine.
interested in, you're doing this research, and we have Jason Birch with us in the first year, and Mark Singleton has visited from India and the perspective within India, and the researchers of India or the academic world of India. Is there a particular viewpoint of outside of India scholars digging into this and material?
Well, it's interesting you should say, so, I mean, sadly, the state of Sanskrit scholarship in India, certainly in yoga field, is pretty poor. There's a couple of institutes in Loyola who are doing okay stuff. They do amazing work collating manuscripts, photographing them and so forth, but they haven't really got any good critical scholars who sort of working on the editions and so forth. They're churning stuff out, but it's not of very good quality. I'm not sure they even know what we're up to. The reason I sort of smiled is that when I first had this, we've made this discovery about the Amrita Siddhi, and you know how the government in India at the moment is very much promoting yoga as part of its kind of brand India, and which is obviously closely allied with a sort of Hindutva approach. So I kind of got excited and nervous and thought, gosh, this is a real bombshell, isn't it? Showing the first Hatha Yoga text was written by Buddhists. This is going to create great ripple. They're going to be. Anyway, I published the article and hadn't heard anything about 6 months ago. I don't think they're interested, to be honest. I don't think.
Well, you also mentioned, and the sadhu was in the yoga pose, mimicking the Western yogini. You use the word, bless you, diluting your potential research material because of the Western influence back to India. And can you touch upon that a little bit more as far as the Western kind of cross-migration influence of our reinterpretation of yoga here now influencing?
Well, I think it's been going back and forth, ever since the beginning of the 20th century in Krishnamacharya and so forth. It seems that the influences are going both ways. In my work, so Mark Singleton in his book, he is always careful to talk about Anglophone yoga. And if so yoga that's discussed and transmitted through books in English. Okay, and I think there's, until recently, that has been still a pretty significant divide in the sadhus, the yogis that I've spent time with, very few of them speak English. So everything's done in Hindi. They're not really aware of the wider yoga world and so forth, or they haven't been until recently. Now, through television and particularly smartphones, everyone's got smartphones. A lot of these brothers have got smartphones. And there's Baba Ramdev every morning on Indian TV doing his yoga classes, which are clearly influenced by globalised yoga, not through the sort of ascetic traditions of yoga. So yeah, I think it's through these media, these new ways of communicating that things are suddenly moving rather faster than they used to. And because of visual sources as opposed to linguistic sources, it also, this Anupnath, he doesn't speak English, but he can easily look at pictures of yogis and yoginis in the West, or whatever, doing Ashtanga series 5 or whatever. That answers your question.
So, it's been a couple of years since I've heard the lecture or been in the text, but the first mention of Hatha Yoga was in a Buddhist text, where it said, and if you cannot meditate and go into these states of visualization, then you practice Hatha Yoga. So I'm wondering, on the ground, with your experience with these Hatha Yogins, is there a sense that they're working through something to go on to this deeper state of meditation or visualization, or it's just an end in itself?
No, I think it's an end in itself. No, they wouldn't say that at all. They're guys, and they think they're doing the most full-on possible practice. But yeah, thanks for bringing that. I kind of thought about mentioning that, those earliest mentions in Buddhist texts of the phrase Hatha Yoga. It's not clarified exactly what's going on there. And then what's curious is that then this Amrita Siddhi text doesn't call it Hatha Yoga. But yeah, it's exactly what's said there. And if these various other techniques, I can't remember what it is, don't work, then use Hatha Yoga. It's kind of seen as a lowly practice. There is something I'm working on now I keep meaning to go back and try to make sense of it, but there's also another definition of Hatha Yoga in an early Tantric Buddhist source, 8th century, 9th century, in which it's said to be the reversal of there are 4 sexual blisses in Tantric Buddhist sexual ritual. It's said to be the reversal of the last 2. I'm wondering if that's got something to do with this celibate tradition as well. Yeah. I'll come back to that. I hope it'll make some sense in a year or 2.
Thank you. If any of you have questions about our ongoing programs and would really like to be on our mailing list, Sarah and Trey and Josie will help you. And look forward to seeing you at some future event.